Ever get the feeling, that someone's just a little off, like something in their wiring is just different? Well, turns out there's a whole science to this, and it's a lot more fascinating and maybe a little creepy than you might think. We're talking psychopaths, not the Hollywood slasher kind, but the real deal. This deep dive is going to take us into the mind of James Fallon. He's a neuroscientist who made it, well, a pretty jaw-dropping discovery. He's got the brain of a psychopath. Yep. The same patterns that are found in, let's just say, folks who aren't exactly winning any nicest neighbor awards. But here's the twist. Fallon's a successful scientist, a family man. Not exactly the image that pops into your head when you hear the word psychopath, right? His book, The Psychopath Inside, a neuroscientist's personal journey into the dark side of the brain, is like a backstage pass to this whole unsettling world. And trust me, things are going to get weird. So how do we even define psychopathy? It's not like there's some psychopath detector you can just buy online. Sadly, neuroscientists actually use a whole toolbox of things to figure this out. Brain imaging, genetics, behavioral analysis, and tests like the PCLR, which scores people on traits like lack of empathy, impulsivity, and, well, a history of making some pretty bad decisions. Think of it kind of like a spectrum, right? On one end, you've got the extreme cases, the ones who make headlines and all that. But most psychopaths are a lot more subtle. They can be charming, successful, even blend right into everyday life. It's kind of unsettling, actually. Now, Fallon's research involved studying brain scans of, well, murderers. And what he found were these specific patterns of damage in areas like the orbital cortex, which is involved in controlling impulses, and the temporal lobe, which helps us process emotions. Makes sense, right? I mean, if those areas aren't firing right, you can imagine the consequences. But here's where things get really interesting. Fallon had been studying brain scans for years, but he made a decision that changed everything. He decided to include his own family in the research, just for kicks, to see if any interesting patterns popped up. And boy, did he find one. One scan had all the classic signs of psychopathy, and it was his. Talk about a no-crap moment. This sent Fallon down a whole rabbit hole of self-discovery. He started digging into his family history and uncovered a, shall we say, colorful lineage. Turns out violence and aggression kind of ran in the family. We're talking ancestors with explosive tempers, a penchant for brawling, and even a king who was notorious for his cruelty. It gets weirder. Fallon discovered he possessed the warrior gene. It's a variant of the MAOA gene that's been linked to aggression and violence. So now he's got the brain scan, the family history, and the genes. It's like the trifecta of things that make you go, But here's the real head scratcher. Fallon hadn't exactly followed in the family tradition of, mayhem. He'd led a successful life, no criminal record, nothing to suggest he was like a danger to society. So what gives? Well, this is what led him to develop his three-legged stool theory, which basically says that psychopathy isn't just about genes or brain structure. It's a combo. You need the genes, the brain damage, and a trigger, usually some kind of severe trauma or abuse early on in life. And this theory, it really got me thinking about my own almost started a bonfire incident back in college. A bunch of us were, shall we say, liberating some furniture from a rival dorm. Things got a little out of hand. The cops showed up, and it was a close call, let me tell you. Looking back, I realized that mix of impulsivity and thrill-seeking could have gone really, really wrong. Thankfully, I had a pretty stable childhood, so that third leg of the stool was never really there. But it makes you wonder, right? What if things had been different? What if those early experiences had flipped a switch in my brain? It's a chilling thought. Fallon's experience raises a fascinating question, though. If psychopathy is so bad, why hasn't evolution just, weeded it out? Why are these genes, these brain patterns still around after all this time? Well, he actually suggests that certain psychopathic traits in moderation might actually be beneficial. Like, imagine a ruthless CEO who closes deals without batting an eye, or a surgeon who can stay totally calm under pressure in the operating room. Maybe there's some kind of evolutionary advantage to having a few folks like that around, right? And here's a thought that'll really bake your noodle. What if we all have a little bit of that psychopath light in us, that drive to succeed, that willingness to take risks, that ability to detach emotionally when things get tough. Maybe it's just a matter of degrees, right? I mean, I know I've definitely had moments where I've had to compartmentalize my feelings to get things done. Like that time I had to give a presentation, even though my cat had just, passed away. It was rough. But I managed to power through it. Does that make me a psychopath? Probably not. But it makes you think, doesn't it? So where does all of this leave us? Is there some kind of sweet spot on the psychopathy spectrum where certain traits are actually beneficial without, turning you into a full-blown supervillain? And what does it mean for those of us who might have a few more 20s on that PCLR test than we'd like to admit? Well, Fallon's story is a wild ride through the dark side of the brain. And it raises some seriously thought-provoking questions about the nature of good and evil, the power of genetics and experience, and the potential for both darkness and light within each of us. But before we go full-blown existential crisis on you, let's dig a little deeper into Fallon's personal journey. It's full of anecdotes that, well, let's just say they make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, we should all be a little more wary of that charming, charismatic guy at the party. Okay, so we've got this neuroscientist, James Fallon, who finds out he's got the brain of a psychopath, right? But he's not, out there masterminding bank heists or anything. He's a respected professor, family man. It's enough to make you wonder if maybe those brain scans aren't always, 100% right. But then you dig into Fallon's personal life and things get a little more interesting, you could say. He starts telling these anecdotes from his childhood. And it's like, whoa, dude, were there no red flags at all? For example, he talks about this incident in first grade. He got in trouble, ended up in the trash can. Most kids, I think, would be pretty traumatized by that, right?
But Fallon, he thought it was hilarious. No remorse, no shame, just pure amusement. It's like he was wired differently even way back then. And as he got older, things didn't exactly, improve. He was fascinated by explosives, really fascinated. He talks about building pipe bombs with his buddies, just for kicks, of course. I mean, I used to play with firecrackers when I was a kid, but pipe bombs, that's a whole other level of risky behavior, don't you think? And then there was this incident in college where he basically kicked a guy out of his car and took off with his date. Just like that. No second thoughts. No guilt. It's almost like he was playing a character in a movie or something, just totally detached from, the real world consequences of his actions. These stories are kind of funny in a dark way, but they're also super unsettling. It's like glimpsing behind the curtain and seeing the machinery of a psychopath's mind at work. But here's the thing that really gets me. Fallon didn't just do these things. He seemed to enjoy them. He got a thrill out of pushing boundaries, out of taking risks, out of manipulating situations to his advantage. And that's where the real danger lies, right? It's not just the lack of empathy. It's the active pursuit of, well, let's just call it mischief, for lack of a better word. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who likes a little excitement is a psychopath. I once went skydiving on a whim. Does that make me a danger to society? I hope not. There's a line, right? And it seems like Fallon, at least in his younger years, walks that line pretty closely. So how did he go from, potential delinquent to successful scientist? Well, that's where the three-legged stool theory comes back into play. Fallon had the genes. He had the brain structure, but he didn't have that third leg, that severe trauma or abuse that can trigger the full-blown expression of psychopathic traits. He credits his upbringing for this. He had a loving family, a stable home life. Not perfect, of course, but good enough to keep him from going totally off the rails. It's like his environment provided this buffer, this safety net that prevented his more destructive tendencies from taking over. This whole thing really makes you think about the whole nature versus nurture debate, right? Is it all in our genes? Or do our experiences play a role in shaping who we become? Fallon's story suggests it's this complex interplay of both. We might be born with certain predispositions, sure, but our environment can either amplify or mitigate
those tendencies, you know.
Mhm.
It's a sobering thought, especially for parents. We like to think we have control over how our kids turn out, but what if some things are just, pre-programmed? What if there are limits to what we can do to shape their behavior? On the other hand, though, Fallon's story also offers this like glimmer of hope. If a guy with the brain of a psychopath can manage to lead a, relatively normal, productive life, maybe there's hope for the rest of us, right?
Mm.
Maybe we can learn to control our impulses, to make better choices, to cultivate empathy, even if it doesn't like come naturally. It's not about denying our darker side. It's about understanding it, managing it, and maybe even using it for good instead of letting it control us. And that's a challenge we can all take on, psychopath or not. So we talked about James Fallon's brain, his family history, his, let's call them youthful indiscretions. But there's this one big question that's been kind of hanging in the air this whole time. Can a psychopath actually change? Can they, like, rewire their brains, learn empathy, become, decent human beings? It's a question that's fascinated scientists, philosophers, and probably anyone who's ever, watched a true crime documentary. And Fallon, being both a neuroscientist and, self-diagnosed psychopath, is kind of uniquely positioned to tackle this whole thing. Now, what does the science actually say? Well, it's complicated, as always. Some studies suggest that psychopaths are kind of stuck with their brain wiring. The areas that control empathy and emotional processing are often underactive, and it's not like you can just, jumpstart them with a cup of coffee or something. But then there's this whole thing about epigenetics, which tells us that our genes aren't necessarily our destiny. Our environment, our experiences, they can actually influence how our genes are expressed. So maybe, just maybe, there's a chance to kind of nudge those neural pathways in a different direction, right? Therapy, medication, mindfulness. They've all shown some promise in helping people manage impulses, develop coping mechanisms, and even, get this, cultivate empathy. Now, it's not like a miracle cure or anything, Psychopathy is pretty deeply ingrained. But the fact that change is even possible is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, isn't it? Fallon himself claims that he's, made some progress. He says he's more aware of his emotional shortcomings, and he's trying to be more present with his family, to actually listen and, maybe fake some feelings every now and then. Whether he's truly changed or just gotten really good at playing the game, who knows? But hey, at least he's trying, right? And that's kind of the point of all this, isn't it? We're all works in progress, constantly evolving, hopefully for the better. We all have our demons, our dark sides, our, moments where we're not exactly proud of ourselves. But it's what we do with those shadows that matters. Fallon's story is a reminder that we can't just write people off based on labels or diagnoses. There's always potential for growth, for change, for, dare I say it, redemption. It might be messy. It might be a lifelong process, but it's possible. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most hopeful message of all. Even in the darkest corners of the human mind, there's this flicker of light. And sometimes all it takes is a little bit of self-awareness, a willingness to confront our shadows, and, maybe a good therapist to fan that flicker into a flame. And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into James Fallon's The Psychopath Inside. It's been a wild ride for sure, but hopefully it's left you with more questions than answers, because after all, isn't that what makes life so fascinating? Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep an eye on those charming, charismatic folks. You never know what might be lurking beneath the surface.